You are now listening to the Cosmo Ill Show, Moorish Movement of the World Service Announcement. Deconstructing the Colonization of Moors, Part 1. There are two major periods of concern when so-called black people ruled the world. One, under the imperial rule of the Kemetic, and two, under the imperial rule of the Moorish. Imperial Kemetic rule is signified by the various pyramids and mounds found all over the earth. Imperial Moorish rule, and being that the Moors were the custodians of the ancient Egyptian sciences and also their descendants, is marked by the spreading of scientific and ethical knowledge and culture under the order of Islam. The large population of Moorish and Muslim descendants throughout the earth bear testimony to imperial Moorish rule. Alright, so let's bring it up to modern times. So-called black people become introduced to the United Nations by Malcolm X in relationship to human rights, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, But the emphasis was placed on International Court of Justice in relationship to the UN structure that most so-called black people became familiar with during that time. And this has been the argument that the United Nations is an organization that is dominated by Western powers, first of all, and that especially the United States, the one who is usurping the laws, international laws, by withholding the true national name and subjecting so-called black people to caste slavery here in North America, dominate the UN the most, and so how can you get justice in this Western system? There's always been a one world government, and it's important to understand this. In modern times, it's represented as the UN. Prior to that, it was represented at the League of Nations. Prior to that, it was represented under imperial rule of Moors. Prior to that, it was represented under imperial rule of the ancients, which is in the Bible referred to as the house of the Lords. So this concept is not new. However, it's misunderstood as to why the rest of the world, there's no excuses for it, but when you look at it, the rest of the world, why at the same time so-called black people are being followed all over the world, they're being economized upon by every other nation, and yet have no protection under the law, so that you can have the Oscar Grants, the Trayvon Martins, the Ramarley Grahams, etc., etc. And there's always going to be the new name. We could go all the way back from Jasper, Texas on up, and even further back, there's Emmett Till. There's always going to be that name, because this is the status of so-called black people in America. Now, we're a nation within a nation, and yet second-class citizens or caste slaves. And the proof of this is the renewing of Civil Rights Act every 25 years. This is a temporary status. No citizen has to endure such a thing. But in looking into the international standards of how an ex-slave or colonized population is supposed to be treated, or the steps towards that are supposed to be taken towards decolonization for groups of people such as the so-called Negroes, blacks, and colors in America, we find within the UN Charter the declaration regarding non-self-governing territories. Keywords or key phrase being non-self-governing. Let's see how it applies. Members of the United Nations which have or assume responsibilities for the administration of territories whose people who have not yet attained the full measure of self-government recognize the principles that the interests of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount. and accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within the system of international peace and security established by the present charter, the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories, and to this end, this is section A, to ensure with due respect for the culture of the peoples concerned, their political, economic, social, and educational advancement, their just treatment, and their protection against abuses. B, to develop self-government, to take due account of the political aspirations of people, and to assist them in the progressive development of their free political institutions according to their circumstances of each territory and its peoples and their various stage of development. Now let's be clear at this point. The United Nations is an organization that was born out of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations also has a covenant, which is the name of their charter. It's termed a covenant, and the covenant of the high contracting parties agreed that, and this is down to, you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, number 4, maintenance of justice and a scrupulous respect for all treaty obligations in dealing with organized people with one another. So prior to the United Nations, there was the League of Nations, and this during the time of Woodrow Wilson. In fact, he's the one who actually gave the presentation of this covenant to the parties which agreed to it. And prior to that, the Europeans were at war over all of the Moorish territories, all of the last remnants of the imperial rule of Moors. And this is why you'll hear Moors referring to the Treaty of Peace and Friendship of 1787, and the reason why the United States was paying a ransom to Tripoli before the mad dash by Stephen Decatur and the forming of the Marines, which finally took possession of the seas from the Moors, known as Barbary pirates, freebooters, Sally Rovers, buccaneers, etc. So the Europeans fought over the territories and finally divided them up into these modern day nation-state boundaries which you see. So during the 16 and 1700s, Moors were effectively colonized, and some exported out of Africa and some colonized where they already were in their territories. And this is how you have Moors coming from Africa, coming from Spain, Moors already residing here and in the North, South, Central America and other parts of the planet. So let us go back to the UN. It was said that they hold in sacred trust. And so there is an international trusteeship system, Article 75, and it states the United Nations shall establish under its authority an international trusteeship system for the administration and supervision of such territories as may be placed thereunder by subsequent individual agreements. These territories are hereafter referred to as trust territories. Now, these trust territories are non-self-governing nations. There have been 80 nations that have gained their independence since the founding of the UN, and that leaves the remaining 16 non-self-governing nations that remain. But what of the so-called Negro in America? Number one, the argument is either brought over on slave ships, which was colonized and taken from the land and used as slaves, or colonized in one of those territories of the imperial Moorish rule, such as North America, which makes them original natives. It must be understood that Moors have been here in America ever since the Kemetic or Egyptian imperial rule, all the way through Moorish imperial rule. The world was not divided as the European style of history claims. So, either way, the so-called Negro in America was colonized. Now, there exists a decolonization process, and this decolonization process that the UN espouses is derived from the process that the League of Nations espouses, and which is derived from the process of treaties and bilateral agreements as to how nations deal with one another in regards to decolonization. Now, I mentioned earlier that Woodrow Wilson was the one who presented the draft of the covenant under the League of Nations, or to the League of Nations, and I believe this was 1912. And it's interesting that in Moorish history, it is said that Woodrow Wilson, Noble Ali, retrieved the Moorish flag from Woodrow Wilson that was placed in the safe at Independence Hall after George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, received the banner of the Moors with the red flag and the 5-pointed green star in the center representing love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice, and which is over 10,000 years old, received this flag. And when Woodrow Wilson was made aware by Noble Ali of his mission to nationalize the ex-slaves and complete the decolonization process, which began with the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln, of which two of the aspects of the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln were not completed, which was the nationalization and the compensation aspects of emancipation, which is written on the Liberty Bell, I believe a verse from Deuteronomy. Remember, this is ancient. When Woodrow Wilson was made aware by the noble son of his mission, the intention of his mission, he said, Woodrow Wilson replied that it would be like trying to put pants on an elephant. Now, the Moorish Holy Temple of Science was founded, according to the questionnaire, in 1913 AD. I believe Woodrow Wilson gave this draft of the covenant to the League of Nations in 1912. Now, keep in mind, the Europeans are finally united, and what is the major topic, the major question of the day? From Marcus Garvey to Noble Ali, what of the so-called Negroes, blacks, and colors in North America, and not just in North America, in the diaspora? Marcus Garvey is said to be the forerunner, and he brought to consciousness and brought to mind the consciousness of a so-called black diaspora. And then Noble Ali, the noble son, got surgical with it and came with the medication and the specific antidote to the problem of so-called blacks in America in this crucial time of globalization of one world government. What of the so-called Negro, black, and colored was the major question. Now, it's interesting that Noble Ali in his oral statements states that people would not understand, and I'm paraphrasing, what he really brought until 50 years down the road, or 50 years later. Which, if we take that from 1913, will bring us smack dab into the 1960s, which, again, the question had intensified to the point of riots in the street. But, yet again, it was usurped with the Civil Rights Acts, these acts that have to be renewed every 25 years, a temporary status. Why? Because by keeping, by keeping so-called blacks in this temporary status, then they are considered non-self-governing people. And being a non-self-governing people, you have to be managed by somebody else until such time you are ready for self-government. And the so-called Negroes, blacks, and colors are being managed by the United States Corporation under the caste labels of Negro, black, colored, African, African American, or whatever name they want to put on the book that keeps you in this status, keeps you a minority. The root word being minor. And minors cannot represent themselves in court. They have to have a guardian. So we see how this is perpetuated. So then how does one become decolonized? Well, the first thing that you need to do in order to become decolonized is to proclaim, to express the desire and have the will to govern self. And so Noble Jew Ali gave the order to proclaim. To proclaim. That's the first step. And the second step, which is where we're at, is being industrious and creating the institutions that are necessary to govern the whole of our people. Ourselves, our tribe, or should I say ourselves, our family, our tribe, our nation, our world. We must recognize ourselves. Too many people are running around trying to figure out how to be recognized by someone else. We need to recognize ourselves and govern ourselves. In order to do this effectively, we need to connect with one another all over the planet, and therefore the Moorish movement of the world is the mode of apparatus that can be used in this day and time to connect all Moors all over the planet. It's an international or world registry of Moors all over the planet. Anyone interested in supporting or becoming a part or registering with the Moorish Movement of the World, please go to moorishmovementoftheworld.com or friend me on Facebook, Cosmo Ill, and inbox me and I can link you in. Anyone who would like to volunteer in registering Moorish charities, political parties, temples, civic groups, student organizations, etc., you can also go to moorishmovementoftheworld.com, and instead of clicking on registration, click on the section that says volunteer. Donations are also accepted at this website. This concludes Moorish Movement of the World service announcement, and whether you're listening to this announcement at the Cosmo Ill Show on Blog Talk Radio or on YouTube, Cosmo Ill Channel, thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Peace, love, all the above.